The morning light filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the Portland Justice Center. 7-year-old Sarah stood motionless in the lobby, her small hand wrapped tightly around the worn leather leash of Max, a golden retriever whose coat gleamed like honey in the sunlight. The dog was no ordinary pet. Max's official documentation identified him as a certified emotional support animal, trained specifically to provide comfort to traumatized children during legal proceedings. His presence was both Sarah's shield and her voice, though ironically, she had no voice to speak of anymore. Her mother, Lisa, stood beside her daughter, one hand resting gently on Sarah's shoulder. Lisa's own composure was barely maintained, a delicate facade constructed through sleepless nights and countless therapy sessions. She wore a navy blue dress, professional but not ostentatious, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. However, anyone observing closely would notice the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes kept darting toward the security checkpoint, as if searching for escape routes. She had whispered words of encouragement to Sarah during the car ride to the courthouse, her voice soft and melodic, designed to calm rather than frighten. "You're so brave," she had said. "Max will be right there with you. Just remember, we're doing this so you can be safe, so we can both be safe." But Sarah hadn't responded. She hadn't spoken a word in exactly 90 days. Not good morning when she woke up. Not I'm scared, when nightmares jolted her from sleep at 3 in the morning. Not even I love you to the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her. The trauma had constructed an invisible wall around her voice, locking it away in some deep, unreachable chamber of her mind that even the most skilled psychologists couldn't access. The victim advocate, a woman named Jennifer Torres, approached them with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her worried eyes. She had been assigned to Sarah's case 3 weeks ago and had spent considerable time trying to build rapport with the child. She held clipboards and documents, but she moved slowly and spoke in hushed tones, understanding the weight of what was about to happen. "How are we doing this morning, Sarah?" she asked gently, crouching down to the child's eye level. Sarah didn't respond, not with words anyway. Instead, she reached down and stroked Max's ears, finding comfort in the silky softness of his fur. Jennifer exchanged a knowing look with Lisa. They had been through this routine multiple times during preparation sessions. Sarah communicated through touch, through her eyes, through the subtle language of her body. Words, however, remained locked behind a door that trauma had slammed shut. The security guard waved them through the metal detector. Sarah walked through mechanically, still holding Max's leash as if it were a lifeline. On the other side, 2 court officers stood waiting to escort them to the courtroom. One of them, a tall man with kind eyes, bent down slightly. "This must be Max," he said, extending his hand for the dog to sniff. Max approached cautiously, his training evident in every measured step. "Good boy," the officer said. "You're going to help that little girl today, aren't you?" "I can tell." It wasn't condescension in his voice, it was respect, the kind of respect that one might show a soldier entering battle. As they walked down the hallway toward Judge Harrison's courtroom, Sarah's eyes took in everything: the wood paneling on the walls, the portraits of stern-faced judges from decades past, the clicking of her mother's shoes against the polished floor. She noticed the way the light changed as they moved through different sections of the building. She noticed how Max's breathing remained steady and calm, a rhythmic comfort that seemed to synchronize with her own panicked heartbeat. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, large and imposing. Sarah's steps became smaller, more hesitant. Her mother gently squeezed her shoulder, a wordless message of encouragement. Jennifer opened one of the heavy wooden doors, and they entered the courtroom proper. Judge Harrison sat elevated behind his bench, his silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the fluorescent overhead lights. He was a man in his early 60s, with steel-gray hair and a face lined by decades of witnessing human tragedy and conflict. He had presided over thousands of cases, but something about this one was different. He had read the file extensively, the allegations of domestic violence, the restraining order, the psychological evaluation of the child before him. He had noted the unusual request to allow an emotional support dog in the courtroom, something he had granted with considerable reservation. As Sarah entered, Judge Harrison's expression shifted. His experience allowed him to read people instantly, to see past the surfaces they presented to the truths beneath. What he saw now was a child who had been fundamentally altered by trauma. Sarah's eyes were old, haunted by experiences no 7-year-old should ever endure. Her small frame seemed to collapse inward on itself, as if she were trying to become invisible. She moved like a ghost through the courtroom, present in body but absent in spirit. The defense attorney, Richard Caldwell, a man in his mid-50s with expensive shoes and an even more expensive suit, watched with barely concealed skepticism. He was being paid handsomely by Sarah's father, Michael, and his job was clear: discredit the prosecution's case and protect his client's interests. The presence of a mute child and a dog seemed to him like desperation, a theatrical ploy to manipulate emotions rather than present evidence. Sarah was guided to the witness stand, a chair that had been specially elevated with cushions to allow her to see the judge and be seen by the courtroom. A bailiff helped position her carefully, as if she were made of glass. Max was allowed to sit beside her, his leash placed gently in her hands. The courtroom went silent, a profound, weighted silence that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what was about to transpire. Judge Harrison looked directly at Sarah, and for a moment his stern judicial demeanor softened almost imperceptibly. He had seen many difficult cases, many traumatized witnesses, but he had never seen a child so thoroughly silenced by fear. He leaned forward slightly, his glasses slipping down his nose as he examined the girl before him. Sarah couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall, and she looked even smaller wrapped in the oversized chair, her feet not quite reaching the floor. Her hands trembled as she stroked Max's fur. "Sarah," the judge said, his voice deliberately gentle, "do you understand that you're in a courtroom and that I need to hear the truth about what happened in your home?" It was a standard question, one he asked every witness, but his tone carried additional weight and compassion. Sarah didn't respond. Her lips remained sealed. Her eyes gazed downward at Max, who pressed his body closer to her leg, his warm presence a tangible anchor in the storm of her anxiety. The prosecutor, Wells, stood and approached the witness stand with careful steps. She had prepared extensively for this moment, knowing that Sarah's testimony was crucial to the case. Without the child's account, the prosecution's entire case became considerably weaker, vulnerable to the defense's inevitable attacks on credibility. "Sarah, I know this is very scary," began softly. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer them however you can. Do you understand?" Sarah's hand tightened on Max's leash. Judge Harrison watched intently, his experienced eyes taking in every subtle movement, every microscopic change in the child's expression. He was wondering how they could possibly extract the truth from a child who couldn't or wouldn't speak. He was wondering if justice was even possible in this case. He had no idea what he would witness in the next few hours, something that would challenge his understanding of testimony, truth, and the extraordinary ways that trauma reshapes human communication. That mystery was about to unfold. 6 months before Sarah entered that courthouse, the family home was a palace masquerading as a prison. The house itself was stunning, a 3-story colonial mansion in the prestigious West Hills neighborhood of Portland, with manicured gardens, a circular driveway, and an imposing iron gate. From the street, it looked like the home of a successful man living the American dream. Neighbors, the friends, admired them. But behind those elegant wooden doors and floor-to-ceiling windows existed a carefully constructed theater of deception. Michael was a man of 48 with the polished appearance of old money and new success. He was a real estate developer of considerable renown, known in Portland's business circles for his keen eye for profitable properties and his seemingly limitless ambition. His office occupied the entire 42nd floor of a downtown high-rise, and his name appeared regularly in the business section of the local newspaper. When he walked into restaurants, people turned to look. When he spoke at chambers of commerce, people listened. To the outside world, Michael represented everything society admired: wealth, intelligence, power, and success. But success had twisted him. His need for control had begun small, almost imperceptible. In the early years of their marriage, Lisa had barely noticed when Michael started commenting on her clothing choices. "That dress makes you look tired," he would say. Or, "Don't you think the other wives dress more professionally?" Over time, these comments evolved into direct demands. He began scrutinizing her wardrobe, removing pieces he deemed inappropriate. He insisted she wear only certain colors, certain styles. He purchased specific brands for her, and became upset if she wore anything else. The control expanded into every corner of her life. Michael monitored her phone calls, checking the bill to see which numbers she had dialed and how long she had spoken to each contact. He opened her emails, reading her correspondence with her mother, her college friends, even her doctor. He controlled the family finances entirely, giving Lisa a strict monthly allowance that barely covered household expenses and groceries. If she spent a penny beyond that allocation, she faced interrogation and punishment. Not physical at first, but psychological, a barrage of accusations about her irresponsibility and foolishness. "You're spending my money like you don't understand the value of a dollar," he would say, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're a financial burden, a liability. Without me, you'd be nothing." Sarah, growing up in this environment, learned to read the subtle signs of her father's moods the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. She could sense the shift in his tone, the tightening of his jaw, the way his hands would clench into fists when something displeased him. She became hypervigilant, constantly monitoring the household atmosphere, adjusting her behavior to avoid triggering his rage. By the time Sarah was 7 years old, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. When her father came home from work, she could tell by the way he closed the car door, softly or harshly, whether the evening would be peaceful or turbulent. She learned which topics were safe to discuss and which would provoke argument. She learned that her mother's peace of mind was directly correlated with how well the house was maintained, how perfectly dinner was prepared, and how quietly and invisibly Sarah herself remained. The screaming matches had started approximately 18 months before that fateful Tuesday evening. Michael's need for control had mutated into something darker, periodic explosions of rage that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. These episodes typically occurred in the evenings, after Michael returned from the office, often fueled by alcohol and perceived slights. Sarah remembered one particular incident from 9 months prior. Her mother had gone to the grocery store without consulting Michael about the menu she planned to prepare. When he discovered that she had purchased salmon instead of the chicken he preferred, his reaction was disproportionate and terrifying. He threw the salmon into the sink, splattering water and scales across the countertop and Lisa's clothing. "How many times do I have to tell you?" he shouted, his face flushed crimson with rage. "How many times do I have to explain what I like? Are you completely incompetent? Are you deliberately trying to ruin my life?" Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, her small body pressed against the frame, as her father grabbed her mother by the hair and pulled her face toward his. She watched as her mother's eyes widened with fear, tears spilling down her cheeks. She watched as her father released her with a shove, sending her mother stumbling backward into the refrigerator. "Clean this up," Michael had commanded, his voice cold and measured. "And I expect chicken tomorrow, real chicken, prepared properly." After he left the kitchen, Sarah's mother sank to the floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah, just 6 years old at the time, had climbed into her mother's lap, trying to comfort the woman who was supposed to comfort her. The months that followed were marked by a pattern of escalation and temporary reconciliation. Michael would explode, causing chaos and terror. Then he would apologize profusely, bringing flowers and gifts, promising that it would never happen again. Lisa wanted desperately to believe him. She suggested couples therapy, Michael attended 2 sessions and then announced that therapy was a waste of time and money. He insisted, not the problem. Lisa was the problem. Sarah might become a problem if she didn't learn to behave better. By the time Sarah turned 7, her mother had transformed almost. The vibrant woman who had once laughed freely and hosted dinner parties had become a ghost. Lisa had lost weight, not in a healthy way, but the kind of weight loss that came from anxiety eating away at her from the inside. Her clothes hung loose on her frame. Dark circles had taken permanent residence beneath her eyes. She moved through the house like a frightened animal, always listening, always aware, always bracing for the next storm. The medication bottles appeared on the bathroom counter. First 1, then 2, then 3. Lisa had begun seeing a therapist in secret, paying cash so Michael wouldn't see the charges on the credit card. She had started researching divorce quietly on her computer late at night, deleting the browser history afterward. She had called a women's shelter helpline once, hanging up before anyone could answer because she heard Michael's car pulling into the driveway. Sarah's own emotional deterioration accelerated in tandem with her mother's. The little girl who had once loved school and excelled at drawing began to withdraw. She developed difficulty concentrating. Teachers noted that Sarah seemed distracted and anxious. She had started having trouble sleeping, complaining of nightmares in which her father chased her through endless hallways. She began experiencing panic attacks, moments where her breathing became shallow and rapid, where her chest felt like it was being crushed beneath an enormous weight. The family pediatrician recommended a child psychologist. Sarah's mother made the appointment, hoping that professional intervention might help her daughter. That's when the decision was made to bring in a support animal. Someone recommended Max and the training program that specialized in children with anxiety disorders stemming from domestic violence exposure. When Max first arrived at the house on a cold February morning, Sarah didn't immediately warm to the dog. She was too traumatized, too withdrawn. But Max was patient. He was trained to wait, to observe, to simply be present without demanding anything in return. Day after day, Max stayed close to Sarah, never pushing, never forcing interaction, but always available. Over the course of several weeks, something shifted. Sarah began to trust the animal in ways she couldn't trust any human. With Max, there was no judgment. There was no anger. There was only unconditional acceptance and loyalty. It was Max who gave Sarah the courage to do what needed to be done. It was Max who provided the foundation of safety, from which Sarah could finally ask her mother the question that had been building in her chest for months. "Mommy, why does Daddy hurt you?" That question, asked in a small, trembling voice while Sarah's fingers twisted in Max's fur, opened the floodgates. Lisa realized that her child's awareness of the abuse, her powerlessness to stop it, and her conviction that somehow she was responsible, was causing damage that extended far beyond her own trauma. It was that realization that finally gave Lisa the courage to make the call that would change everything. The week leading up to that fateful Tuesday had been relatively quiet, which meant in the household that it was deceptively dangerous. Michael had been unusually attentive to Lisa, bringing her flowers, complimenting her appearance, taking an interest in her day. Sarah had learned to recognize these periods of charm as harbingers of something darker, the calm before the storm. It was as if the tension in the house had been building, accumulating like pressure in a closed container, waiting for the moment when it would inevitably explode. That Tuesday morning began like most others. Michael left for the office without incident, kissing Lisa perfunctorily on the cheek before heading out. Lisa prepared Sarah's lunch, drove her to Riverside Elementary School, and returned home to work on her consulting projects from the home office, freelance work that Michael grudgingly allowed because it brought in money without requiring her to actually leave the house unsupervised. At 2:47 p.m., Sarah returned home with the school bus. She found her mother in the study, on the phone with her divorce attorney, a decision Lisa had finally made just 3 days prior. The conversation was hushed, urgent. I need to understand my options, Lisa was saying. I have a 7-year-old daughter. I need to protect her. I don't care about the money or the house. I just need to get us out safely. Sarah stood in the doorway, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, processing what she was hearing. Her mother saw her and quickly ended the call, her face flushing with a complex mixture of emotions: fear that Michael might somehow find out about the call, relief that she had finally taken action, and guilt that her daughter was old enough to understand what was happening. "Hi, sweetie," Lisa said, forcing brightness into her voice. "How was school?" Sarah didn't answer, but she wasn't capable of answering anymore. Instead, she climbed into her mother's lap, something she rarely did anymore despite her age, and pressed her face against her mother's chest. At 5:30 p.m., Michael called from the office. His voice through the speaker phone sounded controlled but strained, an acoustic warning sign of the violence to come. "I need to talk to you about the custody proposal," he said without preamble. "I just received the email. Have you gone completely insane?" Lisa's entire body went rigid. She moved away from Sarah, standing up and creating distance between herself and her daughter. "Michael, I don't think now is a good time." "I don't care what you think is a good time," he interrupted. "I'm coming home. We're going to discuss this face to face, and I suggest you have a reasonable explanation for why you think you can take my daughter away from me." He hung up without waiting for a response. Lisa felt the familiar icy grip of terror squeeze her chest. She looked at Sarah, who had become very still, very small. The child's face had gone pale, her eyes wide and watchful. "It's okay, baby," Lisa said, but the words rang hollow. "Everything is going to be okay." She didn't believe it herself. Michael arrived home at 6:15 p.m., earlier than usual. His BMW screeched into the circular driveway with more force than necessary. From her bedroom window where she had retreated, Sarah heard the car door slam, not gently but with controlled violence. She heard his footsteps on the tile floor of the entryway, heavy and deliberate. She heard his voice calling for Lisa. "Where are you?" Lisa was in the living room, having debated moving to a more neutral location when she heard him arrive. She remained seated on the sofa, trying to project a calm she absolutely did not feel. Michael stormed into the room, his tie already loosened, his suit jacket slung over one arm. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched. He threw the jacket across the back of a chair and turned to face his wife. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" he demanded. "Did you really think you could sneak around behind my back and make plans to steal my daughter from me?" "Michael, I—" "Don't," he said, raising one hand. "Don't you dare speak to me right now. I've worked every single day to build this life, this house, this status, and you're going to throw it all away because you're unhappy, because you think you can take Sarah and start over." "I'm not trying to take her away from you," Lisa said carefully, using the placating tone she had perfected over years of managing his moods. "I'm trying to keep my daughter safe." Something in those words ignited his rage. His face darkened to an alarming shade of purple. He advanced toward Lisa, and she instinctively stood up, putting the sofa between them. "Safe," he spat the word like a curse. "Safe from what? From me? From her own father? You're poisoning her against me. You're turning her into a weapon to use against me." "That's not true." He reached across the sofa and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin with such force that Lisa immediately cried out. The pain was instantaneous and searing. "Don't you ever contradict me," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Don't you ever go behind my back again. You belong to me. Your daughter belongs to me. Everything in this house belongs to me. Do you understand?" "Michael, you're hurting me." He jerked her wrist, twisting it, and Lisa screamed. That scream traveled up the stairs and into Sarah's bedroom like a physical thing, like a hand reaching through her chest and squeezing her heart. Sarah froze, every muscle in her small body going rigid. She had heard her mother cry out before, but never like this. Never with this particular timbre of fear and pain. She left her room without thinking, moving down the hallway like a ghost. She saw them through the open living room doorway, her father's back broad and menacing, his arm extended, his fingers still wrapped around her mother's wrist. She saw her mother's face, contorted with pain and fear, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "Daddy, stop," Sarah screamed. "Stop it, you're hurting her." Michael released Lisa's wrist and turned toward his daughter, his expression shifting from rage to something colder and more terrifying, indifference. He looked at Sarah as if she were an insect that had crawled across his path, something beneath his notice. "Go to your room," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. But Sarah couldn't move. She stood frozen in the doorway, watching as her mother sank onto the sofa, cradling her injured wrist. The skin was already darkening with bruises, the imprint of Michael's fingers becoming increasingly visible. Michael turned away from both of them and left the room, climbing the stairs to his office. In his wake, he left behind a devastation that felt almost tangible. Sarah ran to her mother, climbing into her lap despite her age. Lisa wrapped her uninjured arm around her daughter and wept, not from the physical pain of her wrist, but from the recognition that the line had been crossed. This was no longer a situation that could be managed through careful behavior or subtle appeasement. This had become genuinely dangerous. That night, after Michael had sequestered himself in his office with a bottle of expensive whiskey, Lisa sat on the edge of Sarah's bed and made a decision that would alter the trajectory of all their lives. She was leaving. She would need to be strategic. She would need to be careful. She would need to plan every detail. But she would not spend another night in this house wondering if tonight would be the night that his rage crossed from injury into something irreversible. Max, sensing the emotional turmoil, climbed onto the bed and pressed his body against Sarah, providing comfort that no human voice could offer at that moment. Lisa looked at her daughter's traumatized face and felt a fierce determination crystallize within her. She would protect this child. She would get them both out, and she would do it regardless of the personal cost. The decision to leave happened quickly, which was both blessing and curse. By Wednesday morning, less than 12 hours after Michael's violent outburst, Lisa had packed 2 small suitcases with essentials for herself and Sarah. She had withdrawn cash from a secret account she had maintained without Michael's knowledge, money she had been quietly setting aside for exactly this purpose. She had called a domestic violence shelter and learned about temporary housing options. She had left a message with her divorce attorney, explaining that the situation had become unsafe and that she was leaving immediately. She did not tell Michael she was leaving. Instead, she waited until he left for work Wednesday morning, then drove directly to the Portland Police Department with Sarah and Max. The police officer who took her report, a woman named Detective Sarah Winters, had seen this scenario countless times before. She knew the patterns. She knew the dangers. She knew that women who leave abusive partners often face their greatest risk during the separation period. She took detailed notes, photographed Lisa's bruised wrist, and began the process of filing a police report for assault and battery. "You did the right thing," Detective Winters told Lisa, though the detective's voice carried the weight of someone who knew that doing the right thing often meant entering a bureaucratic maze that could take months or years to resolve. By Wednesday afternoon, Lisa and Sarah were in a small room at the domestic violence shelter, surrounded by donated furniture and the kind of institutional sadness that comes from housing the displaced and traumatized. Sarah sat on a twin bed covered with a generic beige comforter, Max pressed against her side, and she stared at the cinder block wall with an expression so vacant it frightened her mother. The shelter counselor, a woman named, attempted to conduct an intake interview with Sarah. He spoke gently, using a child-friendly voice, asking simple questions about her name, her age, her favorite colors. Sarah didn't respond to any of them. Looked at Lisa with understanding. Has she always been quiet? No, Lisa said, her voice breaking slightly. She was a normal, talkative 7-year-old until recently. The stress has gotten worse and worse, and now. Selective mutism, said, nodding. I've seen it before in children who witness domestic violence. It's her mind's way of protecting her. She's not refusing to speak. The trauma has created a psychological block that prevents her from speaking in certain situations, especially stressful ones. Over the next few days, as Lisa began the formal process of obtaining a protective order and filing for divorce, the reality of Sarah's condition became increasingly apparent. She wouldn't speak to the counselors at the shelter. She wouldn't speak to the pediatrician who examined her for physical signs of abuse. She wouldn't speak to the psychologist who was assigned to evaluate her for the custody proceedings. But she would touch Max. She would cling to the dog like he was the only solid thing in a world that had become incomprehensibly liquid and unstable. 2 weeks after leaving Michael, Lisa received a call from the prosecutor's office. Wells, the assistant district attorney assigned to the case, wanted to meet with Lisa and Sarah to discuss the possibility of criminal charges against Michael for domestic violence and assault. The physical evidence is good, explained during their meeting at the prosecutor's office. The police report is thorough. Your medical documentation of the injuries is clear. However, to have the strongest possible case, we really need Sarah's testimony about what she witnessed. She's the only eyewitness to the assault, and her testimony would be powerful. Lisa felt her stomach drop. She looked at her daughter, sitting silently beside her, and shook her head. Sarah hasn't spoken in 2 weeks, Lisa said quietly. She can't testify. She won't testify. Her therapist says forcing her could cause significant psychological harm. His expression shifted to one of concern mingled with frustration. I understand. We'll work with her slowly. We have time. The trial isn't for several months. Perhaps with therapy and preparation she'll be able to participate. But as the months passed, Sarah's silence only deepened. Dr. Martinez, the child psychologist working with Sarah, explained the mechanics of selective mutism to Lisa with careful precision. Sarah's brain has created a protective mechanism, Dr. Martinez said during a parent consultation. In her mind, speaking equals danger. Speaking to her father led to violence. Speaking up for her mother didn't stop the abuse. Her unconscious mind has decided that silence equals safety. But she has to testify, Lisa said desperately. The prosecutor says without her testimony, the case is weaker. Forcing Sarah to testify before she's psychologically ready could cause permanent damage, Dr. Martinez replied, her voice firm but compassionate. We need to rebuild her sense of safety first. We need to help her understand that her voice matters, that speaking doesn't lead to punishment, that adults are capable of protecting her. That's going to take time. Meanwhile, Richard Caldwell, the defense attorney hired by Michael, began aggressively challenging the prosecution's case. He filed motions arguing that Lisa's testimony was inherently biased, that she had motivation to lie to gain custody of Sarah, that there were no independent witnesses to corroborate her account of the assault. The defendant has a constitutional right to confront his accuser, Caldwell argued in court filings. The prosecution appears to be attempting to present a case built entirely on the word of a woman who stands to gain custody and financial support through the defendant's conviction. That's not justice. That's bias. Wells worked tirelessly to strengthen the case. She obtained phone records showing that Lisa had called the domestic violence hotline on the evening of the incident. She secured a copy of Lisa's initial police report and the photographs of her injuries. She consulted with domestic violence experts who could testify about the patterns and escalation of abusive behavior. But without Sarah's testimony, the voice of the child who had actually seen her father grab and twist her mother's wrist, the case felt incomplete. Months into the process, Judge Harrison held a pre-trial conference to discuss evidentiary issues. Caldwell argued vociferously. Your Honor, the prosecution's case relies on hearsay and one woman's potentially biased account. Where is the independent corroboration? Where is the neutral witness? The defense has a right to confront witnesses, and we cannot confront a 7-year-old child if she won't testify. Stood and responded passionately. Your Honor, the defendant's own actions have rendered the most important witness unable to speak. Sarah witnessed her father commit an act of violence. She's so traumatized by what she witnessed that she's developed selective mutism. That's not a reason to allow the defendant to escape accountability. That's a reason to adapt our procedures to accommodate her trauma. Judge Harrison looked troubled. I'm not unsympathetic to the child's condition, he said carefully. However, the defendant does have constitutional rights. I'm going to recommend that the parties continue working with the child's psychologist to prepare her for testimony. If she becomes capable of testifying, we'll revisit this. If not, we'll need to address the evidentiary issues at trial. As months continued to pass, Wells became increasingly frustrated. She visited Sarah and Lisa regularly, trying different approaches, different strategies. She brought Sarah toys and let her draw pictures instead of answer questions. She used anatomical dolls to help Sarah show what had happened instead of tell. Nothing worked. Sarah remained locked in her silence, her voice imprisoned behind a wall of trauma that no prosecutor's technique could breach. By the time Sarah's appearance in Judge Harrison's courtroom was scheduled, Wells had begun to lose hope. The case that should have been straightforward, a man caught on police report assaulting his wife, had become complicated by a child's broken voice. What didn't know was that Sarah had been preparing for this moment in ways no one had anticipated. She had been learning a language that existed beyond words, a communication system so profound that it would eventually shatter everyone's preconceptions about what testimony actually means. Dr. Martinez's office was deliberately designed to feel less like a medical clinic and more like a comfortable living room. Soft lighting filtered through gauzy curtains. A worn Persian rug covered most of the hardwood floor. Shelves held an extensive collection of children's books, toys, games, and art supplies. Plants in ceramic pots sat in corners, providing touches of green and life. It was the kind of space where traumatized children could, theoretically, feel safe enough to begin healing. Sarah had been coming to Dr. Martinez's office twice weekly for nearly 3 months. In that time, she had not spoken a single word. This particular Thursday afternoon was like all the others. Lisa accompanied Sarah to the appointment and sat in the waiting room with a cup of weak coffee and a month-old magazine, while her daughter went into the inner office with the psychologist. Max remained with Sarah, as he did at nearly every appointment, a constant presence of comfort and stability. Dr. Martinez began, as always, with gentle attempts at engagement. She offered Sarah choices. Would you like to draw today, or would you prefer to play with the dolls? Sarah didn't respond verbally, but she pointed toward the art supplies. Dr. Martinez had learned to interpret these minimal gestures as communication, accepting them as valid responses even though they fell far short of what the prosecutor desperately needed: clear, verbal testimony about what Sarah had witnessed. As Sarah settled into drawing at the low table, Max positioned himself at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his brown eyes tracking every movement his charge made. The dog had become an extension of Sarah in many ways, attuned to her emotional states with an almost supernatural sensitivity. About 30 minutes into the session, something shifted. Sarah had been drawing in silence, creating what appeared to be a house with a large, angry figure inside it and a smaller figure hiding behind a door. Her pencil moved with jerky, stressed movements. Then, suddenly, she set down the pencil and turned toward Max. She reached out her right hand and gently stroked the dog's neck in 3 deliberate, measured strokes. Max immediately responded by shifting his position and placing his front paw on Sarah's lap. Dr. Martinez watched with casual interest, jotting notes about the child-animal interaction. Then Sarah did something that caused the psychologist to lean forward in her chair, her clinical detachment suddenly replaced by intense focus. Sarah's fingers moved to Max's left ear. She touched it lightly, held for 2 seconds, released. Then she reached lower and tapped 3 times in rapid succession on Max's shoulder. Max's response was immediate and precise. He shifted his entire body weight to his left side and made a small whimpering sound. Dr. Martinez set down her pen. She recognized what she was witnessing. This wasn't random play. This was intentional. This was communication. Over the next 15 minutes, Sarah's hands danced across Max's body, touching his neck in different patterns, tapping his legs, stroking his back in varying rhythms. And Max responded to each signal with trained precision. It was like watching someone conduct a symphony, except the instrument was a living, breathing dog, and the music was a language composed entirely of touch and response. When the session ended, Dr. Martinez didn't mention what she had observed to Sarah. Instead, after Sarah and Max had left the office, she immediately called the number she had for Lisa, who was still sitting in the waiting room gathering her daughter's coat and backpack. "Ms., I wonder if we could step into my office for a few minutes," Dr. Martinez asked, her voice carefully neutral. In the privacy of her office, Dr. Martinez explained what she had witnessed. "Sarah has developed a complex system of communication with Max," Dr. Martinez said, her eyes bright with a mixture of professional excitement and therapeutic hope. "It's not a trained system, at least not in the conventional sense. It appears to be something Sarah and Max have created together. Different touches and taps correspond to different responses from the dog. Sarah is essentially using Max as a translator." Lisa's hands went to her mouth. Does this mean she can communicate, that she could testify? "It means," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "that Sarah's silence is not a reflection of her inability to share information. It's a reflection of her trauma-induced block against verbal speech. However, if we can establish what these signals mean, if we can create a consistent vocabulary of touch and response, then theoretically, yes, Sarah could communicate her account of what happened. Not in words, but in meaning, in truth." Dr. Martinez immediately contacted Wells at the prosecutor's office and Jennifer Torres, the victim advocate. A meeting was scheduled for the following week. When Dr. Martinez demonstrated Sarah's communication system to the assembled group, Wells' expression transformed from skepticism to astonishment. They watched as Sarah, sitting comfortably on the floor with Max, executed a series of hand signals. She touched Max's neck with a specific pattern, 3 slow strokes, 1 quick tap. Max responded by pawing at the floor 3 times and then barking once. "What does that mean?" asked. Dr. Martinez consulted her notes. "Based on the pattern Sarah has established, that sequence appears to mean yes, or I saw that. We've been documenting her signals for the past week. She's created a fairly sophisticated system. Different locations on Max's body correspond to different categories. Neck signals seem to relate to yes-no responses. Shoulder signals seem to indicate emotional states. Leg signals appear to relate to specific events or people." Over the next several weeks, Dr. Martinez worked intensively with Sarah to map out her communication system. She sat with Sarah and Max multiple times per week, documenting each signal and its corresponding response, gradually building a lexicon of Sarah's touch-based language. What emerged was nothing short of remarkable. Sarah had created a comprehensive system through which she could communicate about people, Michael, Lisa, others, places, home, school, shelter, emotional states, scared, sad, safe, angry, and actions, hitting, grabbing, yelling, protecting. One particularly poignant discovery came during a session when Dr. Martinez documented the signals Sarah used when discussing her mother. Sarah's touch pattern was gentle, almost reverent, long, slow strokes accompanied by a soft whine from Max that sounded almost like grief. When discussing her father, Sarah's touches became sharp and jerky, and Max would respond with tense body language and defensive posturing. She's encoding emotion into her communication, Dr. Martinez explained to Wells during a consultation. The way she touches Max carries information about her feelings regarding the content she's communicating. This isn't just a translation system. It's a sophisticated expression of emotional truth combined with factual information. By the time they had documented approximately 80 different signal response sequences, it became clear that Sarah possessed not just the ability to communicate, but the ability to provide detailed, nuanced testimony about the events she had witnessed. Wells contacted Judge Harrison's chambers and requested an emergency hearing. "We've made a breakthrough," told the judge. "Sarah has developed a system of communication with her emotional support dog that allows her to convey complex information. We believe this system is sufficiently reliable and meaningful to allow for testimony, though it will require interpretation by a trained expert." Caldwell immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. A child testifying through hand signals to a dog. This is precisely the kind of theatrical manipulation I was concerned about. This isn't testimony. This is speculation dressed up as evidence." But Judge Harrison was intrigued. "I'd like to see this system in action," he said. "Bring the child and the psychologist. We'll conduct a hearing to determine whether this methodology is sufficiently reliable for courtroom testimony." 2 weeks later, Sarah sat in a private judge's chambers with Max, and she demonstrated her communication system. She touched Max in specific patterns in response to carefully constructed questions. The judge watched, his skepticism gradually replaced by something approaching wonder. When Sarah was asked through her signals, "Did you see your father hurt your mother?" her hands moved to Max's neck with a pattern that Dr. Martinez had documented as the signal for yes. The dog responded with certainty, placing his paw on Sarah's lap. When asked, "Were you scared?" Sarah's touches became shaky and hurried, and Max whimpered and pressed closer to her. When asked, "Do you want to tell the truth about what happened?" Sarah's hand moved to Max in long, deliberate strokes that Dr. Martinez had learned to recognize as, "Yes, I do." Judge Harrison looked at the child before him, a 7-year-old girl who had been silenced by trauma but who had found, in the companionship of a dog, a pathway back to her voice. "I'm going to allow this testimony," he said finally, "but we'll need the expert present at trial to interpret and verify the signals. This is unprecedented, but it serves the interests of justice." Wells left that hearing with a sense of cautious hope. Sarah would be able to testify after all, not in the way anyone had anticipated, but in a way that was authentic to her experience and true to her trauma. What no one yet knew was how profoundly this moment would change not just Sarah's case, but the entire judicial system's understanding of how we listen to the most vulnerable witnesses among us. The morning of Sarah's testimony arrived under gray Portland skies, as if even the weather understood the significance of what was about to transpire. The courthouse hallway was crowded with journalists, courthouse regulators, and curious observers who had heard rumors about the unusual testimony method. Word had spread through the legal community about the little girl who would testify through her dog, and the case had attracted attention far beyond what would normally be expected for a domestic violence prosecution. Judge Harrison's courtroom was packed to capacity. The jury box held 12 citizens who had been selected specifically for this trial. In the gallery, reporters with notepads sat beside social workers and psychologists who had heard about the case and wanted to witness it firsthand. Michael sat at the defense table, his expression a carefully constructed mask of confidence, though his hands gripped the edge of the table with white-knuckled intensity. His attorney, Richard Caldwell, sat beside him, his jaw set with the determination of a man preparing to dismantle what he still considered a theatrical manipulation. Lisa sat in the front row of the gallery, her face pale but resolute. She had prepared herself for this moment, understanding that her daughter's wordless testimony would be the most difficult thing Sarah had ever had to do. Wells stood at the prosecution table, her case files organized meticulously before her. Beside her stood Dr. Martinez, who would serve as the interpreter of Sarah's communication system. Dr. Martinez had spent weeks preparing for this moment, documenting every signal, every response, every meaning. She carried with her a comprehensive guide to Sarah's lexicon of touch, a map of Sarah's unique language. At 9:47 a.m., Sarah was called to the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent, not the normal courtroom quiet that comes from routine procedure, but a profound, almost sacred silence, the kind of silence that descends when people sense they are about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah walked slowly into the courtroom, her small frame seeming impossibly fragile beneath the weight of everyone's attention. Max walked beside her, his leash held gently in her trembling hand. The bailiff had been instructed to allow the dog to accompany Sarah to the witness stand, a significant accommodation that would have been unthinkable in previous years. Sarah was helped onto the specialized chair, elevated with cushions so that her face was visible to the judge, jury, and courtroom observers. Max was positioned beside her, his body pressed against the leg of the chair. Sarah's hands shook as she reached down to touch his neck. Judge Harrison began with the standard questions, his voice deliberately gentle. "Sarah, do you understand that you're here to tell the truth about what you saw?" Sarah's hand moved to Max's neck in the signal Dr. Martinez had documented as affirmation, 3 slow strokes followed by 1 quick tap. Max responded by placing his paw directly on Sarah's lap. A small murmur rippled through the courtroom as observers recognized the exchange. "Do you understand that you can show me what happened by using Max, with Dr. Martinez helping to explain what your signals mean?" Sarah's hands trembled as she executed the affirmation sequence again. Max's response was immediate and precise. Wells stood and approached the witness stand. She had carefully prepared her questions, knowing that each one needed to be specific enough to elicit meaningful responses, but not so leading that Caldwell could later argue she had put words in Sarah's mouth. "Sarah, I want to ask you about what happened on Tuesday, March 15th. Were you at home that day?" Sarah's hand moved to Max's neck with the affirmation pattern, but this time her touch was lighter, more hesitant, as if the mere act of remembering that day was depleting her courage. "Were you at home when your father came home from work?" Again, the affirmation signal, but Sarah's other hand had begun to tremble noticeably. "Did your mother make a phone call that afternoon?" Sarah's touch pattern changed. Her hand moved to Max's shoulder with quick, agitated taps, the pattern Dr. Martinez had documented as indicating yes, but with anxiety attached. "After your father came home, did he and your mother have a conversation?" Affirmation, but Sarah's entire body had begun to shake. "During that conversation, did your father raise his voice?" "Yes." Sarah's hand moved with jerky, stressed movements. Max shifted his body and made a soft whining sound, as if the dog himself was absorbing the trauma being relived. "Did your father touch your mother?" Sarah's hands moved to Max's front leg and gripped it with what appeared to be almost painful intensity. She held the grip for several seconds, then released. The signal was unmistakable, yes, and the holding and gripping communicated the force and duration of that touch. A woman in the jury box wiped her eyes. Richard Caldwell rose from his seat. "Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning. We're supposedly receiving testimony, but what we're actually witnessing is a highly subjective interpretation of ambiguous hand signals. This is not reliable evidence." Judge Harrison's expression hardened. "Counselor, the witness is responding to specific questions with specific signals that have been documented and by an expert. Dr. Martinez is prepared to testify as to the meaning of these signals. The reliability of this methodology will be established through proper foundation. Your objection is overruled. Continued with her questions, each one building the narrative of what Sarah had witnessed. As she questioned the child, Sarah's signals became increasingly detailed. When asked about her emotional state during the incident, Sarah's touch pattern on Max became almost frantic. When asked whether she had run downstairs to try to help her mother, Sarah's hands moved in a distinct pattern, up and down, indicating motion, journey, descent. Dr. Martinez translated, "Yes, I ran." The testimony painted a vivid picture of the assault, not in words, but in movement, gesture, and the profound emotional context that Sarah encoded into every signal. Then asked the crucial question, "Sarah, when your father grabbed your mother's wrist, did you see his face?" Sarah nodded, her chin trembling visibly. "Can you show me what his face looked like? Show me through Max how angry he was." Sarah's hand moved to Max's neck with a pattern that was altogether different from anything she had demonstrated before. Her touch was rough, almost violent, rapid stabbing motions, then hard squeezes, then more rapid jabs. Max responded by tensing his entire body, his ears flattening, his tail dropping. The dog looked frightened, and in that moment, every person in the courtroom understood that Sarah wasn't just describing her father's anger. She was channeling it, transferring the violence of his emotion into her touch. A juror on the back row put her face in her hands. When Caldwell rose for cross-examination, he attempted to undermine the testimony by arguing that the signals were too subjective, that Dr. Martinez was inserting her own interpretations, that Sarah could be conveying anything or nothing at all. But as he questioned Sarah about specific details, the time of day, the color of her mother's clothing, the words that had been spoken, Sarah's signals remained consistent with what she had previously communicated. When Caldwell tried to suggest that Sarah was confused or that her recollection was inaccurate, Sarah's response was a firm, decisive signal that Dr. Martinez translated as, "No, I remember clearly." At one point, Caldwell asked Sarah a question designed to confuse her. "You said your father grabbed your mother's wrist with his right hand, correct?" But Sarah's signal pattern changed. She touched Max in a way that, according to Dr. Martinez's documentation, meant no or incorrect. Then Sarah executed an entirely new signal sequence, her hand moving to Max's neck and then down to his shoulder and then to his leg, a combined signal that Dr. Martinez, after consulting her documentation, interpreted carefully. "Sarah is indicating that your statement was partially correct, but that she needs to clarify. She's saying that her father grabbed with his right hand, but she wants to communicate something additional about the force or manner of the grab." Sarah's hands moved to Max's front leg again, and she gripped it hard, held it, then slowly twisted it slightly to the left while maintaining the grip. Max bore the manipulation calmly, recognizing it as part of the communication protocol. Sarah is showing that the grab was not just a grab, but that it involved twisting of the wrist, Dr. Martinez translated. The specificity of the detail, the twist that went beyond simple grabbing, hung in the courtroom air like a final, undeniable truth. This was not a child making up a story. This was a child conveying precise details about what she had witnessed. Judge Harrison watched the exchange with an expression that had evolved from skepticism to something approaching reverence. He was witnessing testimony that transcended language, testimony that lived in the body and the gesture, and the profound connection between a traumatized child and an animal that had become her voice. By the time questions concluded and Caldwell had completed his cross-examination, something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom. The jury had heard Sarah's testimony, not in words, but in truth. The judge had witnessed a form of testimony that challenged his understanding of what evidence actually means. The observers in the gallery had seen something they had never expected to see. A child who had been silenced by trauma speaking with more clarity and honesty than many witnesses who had under oath using conventional speech. After Sarah was excused from the witness stand, the courtroom had shifted into a different emotional register. The jury sat in a state of subdued shock. The gallery observers whispered among themselves, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, and during that 15-minute break, the implications of Sarah's testimony began to crystallize. What had transpired was unprecedented in Judge Harrison's courtroom, perhaps unprecedented in any courtroom in Oregon. A 7-year-old child, through a sophisticated system of tactile communication, had provided detailed, consistent, and emotionally authentic testimony about a violent crime. The signals had been interpreted in real time by an expert, and the testimony had survived cross-examination remarkably well. When the court reconvened, Wells called Dr. Martinez to the stand as an expert witness in animal-assisted communication and childhood trauma. This was a crucial step in establishing the reliability and foundation for Sarah's testimony. Carefully walked Dr. Martinez through the process of documenting Sarah's communication system, the weeks of careful analysis, the creation of the signal lexicon. "Can you explain to the jury how you came to understand what Sarah's signals mean?" asked. Dr. Martinez gestured calmly as she explained. Sarah and Max developed this system organically through their therapeutic relationship. Over many weeks, I observed patterns emerging. Specific touches and tap sequences consistently elicited the same responses from Max. When I would use the signals myself, Max would respond identically. This consistency is what establishes the reliability of the system. Did you verify that these signals have consistent meanings? Absolutely. Over a 3-week period, I documented 87 distinct signal response sequences. I then tested Sarah's consistency by asking her the same question at different times, sometimes changing the phrasing slightly. Her signal pattern remained consistent approximately 94% of the time, a rate comparable to verbal testimony when accounting for normal variation in memory and interpretation. Caldwell rose for cross-examination, his skepticism evident in the set of his shoulders. "Dr. Martinez, isn't it possible that you're imposing meaning onto ambiguous hand signals? That you're reading into the dog's responses what you expect to hear rather than what's actually being communicated?" "It's theoretically possible," Dr. Martinez acknowledged, "which is why I brought my complete documentation to this trial. Every signal response sequence has been recorded, photographed, and, additionally, the specificity of Sarah's responses, such as her indication that the wrist grab involved a twisting motion, demonstrates that she's communicating distinct, meaningful information. She's not simply responding randomly. She's providing consistent, detailed information about what she witnessed." But the dog could be responding to subtle cues in Sarah's touch, couldn't he? Couldn't Sarah be unconsciously signaling what response she wants? "That's a fair question," Dr. Martinez said, "and that's why I conducted blind testing. I asked Sarah questions without being able to see her signals, while an observer recorded her hand movements and Max's responses. In every case, Max responded appropriately to what Sarah was communicating. The dog is not reading Sarah's subconscious expectations. He's responding to deliberate, trained signals." After Dr. Martinez's testimony concluded, the prosecution called the medical expert who had examined Lisa. "Doctor, an emergency room physician and domestic violence specialist, about the injuries Lisa had sustained. The bruising pattern on Ms. wrist is consistent with a grab from an adult hand," Doctor explained, pointing to photographs displayed on the courtroom monitor. "The specific pattern of finger marks indicates significant force. The twisting component that young Sarah demonstrated in her testimony is consistent with what we see in the contusions. Particularly, this spiral pattern bruising that indicates the wrist was twisted while being held." Gestured to the photographs. "Is this the type of injury that typically occurs in a domestic violence context?" "Yes," This pattern, grab with rotation, is actually quite common in intimate partner violence. It indicates anger and an attempt to dominate and control. The force required to create this pattern is significant. This wasn't an accidental contact. This was deliberate violence. The detective who had responded to the initial police call about the scene, Lisa's demeanor, her injuries, her account of events. The 911 dispatcher about the call that had been placed from the house on that Tuesday evening, the panic evident in the caller's voice. But what had transformed the entire trajectory of the trial was not these pieces of corroborating evidence, powerful as they were. What had changed everything was Sarah's testimony. Because for the first time, there was an eyewitness account, a child's perspective, unfiltered by adult interpretation or legal framing. There was the voice of someone who had actually seen the crime occur, even if that voice came through hand signals and a dog's response rather than through words. Judge Harrison sat elevated behind his bench, absorbing all of this testimony, and his expression gradually into something that resembled profound contemplation. He was a judge who had presided over hundreds of cases, but he had never witnessed anything quite like this. He was grappling with the realization that his understanding of what constitutes valid testimony might need to be revised. The trial continued for 3 more days. The defense presented its case, with Michael ultimately choosing not to testify, a decision his attorney had clearly advised him to make. Character witnesses on his behalf, speaking to his business success and community reputation. But under Wells' cross-examination, each witness was forced to acknowledge that character outside the home is not necessarily indicative of behavior within the home. Finally, on the evening of the 4th day, closing arguments began. Wells stood before the jury with a clarity of purpose that had been absent at the beginning of the trial. Back, when the case had seemed uncertain due to the lack of eyewitness testimony. "You have heard testimony from Lisa about what occurred in her home on March 15th, said. You have heard from a medical expert explaining the injuries consistent with that account. You have heard from police and emergency responders who documented the scene. But most importantly, you have heard from Sarah." Paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. Sarah could not testify in the conventional way because trauma has stolen her ability to speak those words. But trauma has not stolen her ability to know the truth. Trauma has not stolen her ability to communicate what she witnessed. Through a system of touch and gesture that she developed with her emotional support animal, Sarah has told you, with remarkable clarity and consistency, exactly what she saw on that day. Walked slowly in front of the jury box. Her signals were consistent. Under cross-examination, she remained steadfast. When pressed, she corrected an inaccuracy in opposing counsel's framing. That the grab involved a twist, a detail that is corroborated by the medical evidence of Ms. injuries. This is not a confused child inventing stories. This is a traumatized child communicating with more precision than many adults would be capable of. Gestured toward where Sarah sat in the gallery, held securely by her mother's arm. That little girl has shown more courage than most adults ever will. She has stepped forward to speak truth despite her trauma. She has used every resource available to her to communicate what happened in that home. And I'm asking you to honor her courage by believing her, by finding the defendant guilty of the assault she witnessed, and by sending a message that violence in the home will not be tolerated in this community. Richard Caldwell's closing argument focused on doubt and process, on the irregularity of Sarah's testimony, on the defense's right to confront witnesses. But his words rang hollow in the courtroom air. The jury had seen something that transcended legal procedure. They had seen a child fighting to tell the truth. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed. Michael sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw clenched. Lisa held Sarah's hand in the gallery, though Sarah couldn't possibly understand the legal complexities of what was about to unfold. Max pressed against Sarah's leg. On the charge of assault in the 3rd degree, the jury foreman read. "We find the defendant guilty." Lisa gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. Michael's face went white. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder, but Michael shrugged it away, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. Judge Harrison's gavel came down firmly, establishing the court's order. But before he dismissed the jury, he spoke to them directly. "I want to commend you on your service. You were asked to evaluate testimony in a form that is unusual in these courts. You were asked to listen to truth delivered through gesture and signal rather than through conventional speech. You chose to hear that testimony with open minds and compassionate hearts. That's what justice requires." As the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos, journalists rushing toward the exits, observers discussing what they had witnessed, defense attorneys conferring with their client, Judge Harrison remained on the bench for a moment longer. His eyes found Sarah in the gallery. The little girl who had been silenced by trauma had spoken, and in doing so, she had not just won her case. She had opened a door to a new understanding of how justice could listen to its most vulnerable witnesses. 3 weeks after the verdict, Judge Harrison's courtroom was crowded again, this time for the sentencing hearing. Michael stood before the judge, no longer wearing his expensive suit with the practiced confidence of a successful businessman. Instead, he appeared diminished, his shoulders hunched, his face marked by the reality of conviction. Judge Harrison read from his prepared statement, his voice measured and deliberate. "Michael, you have been found guilty of assault in the 3rd degree for your actions on March 15th. During this trial, we heard testimony, unprecedented testimony, from a child who witnessed your violence. That child, your own daughter, was so traumatized by what she witnessed that she lost the ability to speak. Yet she found another way to communicate. She found courage in the presence of an animal and told the truth despite her fear." The judge looked directly at Michael, his eyes hard. "You chose violence. You chose to use your strength against someone weaker. You chose to do this in front of your own child. Those choices have consequences." Judge Harrison sentenced Michael to 2 years in prison, followed by 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and psychological evaluation. Additionally, he granted a 5-year protective order preventing Michael from any contact with Lisa or Sarah. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison said, addressing the courtroom rather than just the defendant, "I am recommending to the Oregon State Bar that this case be studied as a potential model for how our judicial system can better accommodate traumatized witnesses, particularly children. Sarah's testimony today represents a paradigm shift in how we understand and receive evidence in domestic violence cases." In the gallery, Lisa held Sarah's hand. Sarah didn't fully understand what was happening, but she sensed the finality in the judge's words, the closure that seemed to settle over the courtroom like a benediction. Max pressed against her leg, providing the same steady comfort he had provided throughout this entire ordeal. Over the following months, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah didn't immediately regain her voice. Dr. Martinez had cautioned Lisa not to expect a sudden recovery. Trauma doesn't heal on a timeline that makes sense to those outside of it. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. 6 weeks after the verdict, Sarah whispered a single word to Max, "Good boy." 2 words, but they were words, spoken aloud for the first time in more than 5 months. Lisa wept when she heard them. Over the next weeks and months, Sarah's voice returned in incremental steps. She spoke to Max first, always to Max. She would sit with the dog in her lap and tell him about her day, about her fears, about her memories. Max would listen with the patient attention of someone who understood that words, once found again, were precious and fragile things. Then gradually she began speaking to her mother. Small phrases at first. "I'm tired. Can we go outside? I love you." The last phrase came out in a rush of tears and emotion, as if Sarah had been holding it inside for so long that when it finally emerged, it brought all the pent-up love and trauma with it. Dr. Martinez saw Sarah twice weekly for another year. Gradually, the therapeutic focus shifted from survival and trauma management to processing and healing. Sarah drew pictures of the courtroom experience, and Dr. Martinez helped her understand what had happened, why it was necessary, and how it had actually been an expression of her power rather than her powerlessness. "You told the truth," Dr. Martinez told Sarah during one session, "even though telling the truth was scary. You used your voice, even though it wasn't a regular voice. And because you told the truth, people listened. Your mother is safe now because you were brave." Sarah, now 8 years old, processed this slowly. Understanding didn't come all at once, but gradually she began to reconstruct her sense of agency. She had not been helpless. She had been strategic. She had found a way to communicate when conventional methods failed. By the time Sarah was 9 years old, she had largely returned to functioning as a normal child. She went to school. She made friends. She laughed and played and did homework. The trauma was still there. It would always be there, woven into her cellular memory, but it no longer defined every moment of her existence. Meanwhile, something entirely unexpected was happening in Oregon's legal system. Judge Harrison had meant what he said about recommending systemic change. He submitted a formal report to the Oregon Judicial Council detailing Sarah's case, the methodology of her testimony, and the implications for how the judicial system might better serve traumatized witnesses. The report included Dr. Martinez's documentation of the communication system, transcripts of Sarah's testimony, and her analysis of its reliability. The report created waves in legal circles across the entire state. Law schools began discussing the case in courses on evidence and procedure. Other judges started examining their own procedures for handling traumatized child witnesses. Advocacy groups for domestic violence survivors seized on the case as evidence that the legal system needed to be more flexible and innovative in how it listened to vulnerable witnesses. 1 year after the verdict, Judge Harrison was invited to speak at a statewide judicial conference about traumatized witnesses. He brought Dr. Martinez with him. Together, they presented the case and the methodology to more than 200 judges from across Oregon. "What Sarah demonstrated," Judge Harrison told his colleagues, "is that truth can be communicated in forms we don't traditionally expect. As judges, we are trained to value verbal testimony, to measure credibility by demeanor and consistency in speech. But what if a traumatized child cannot speak? Do we let the trauma silence them twice, once through its initial impact, and again by excluding them from participation in their own justice?" The response was overwhelming. By the end of that judicial year, 3 other Oregon courts had begun implementing protocols similar to what had been used in Sarah's case, allowing emotional support animals in courtrooms for traumatized child witnesses, training experts in alternative communication methods, and creating procedures that could accommodate testimony in non-conventional forms. The case became known informally in legal circles as the Sarah precedent. 18 months after the trial, Lisa and Sarah attended a community advocacy event where they spoke about their experience. Lisa stood at a podium and described what domestic violence had taken from her, her sense of safety, her confidence, her ability to protect her child. Then she described what it had given her: clarity, purpose, and a daughter whose resilience had changed an entire system. When it came time for Sarah to speak, the little girl approached the microphone hesitantly. The crowd fell silent, understanding the significance of this moment. A child who had been silenced by trauma, now choosing to speak. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice small but clear. "I couldn't talk for a long time because I was scared, but I found a way to tell the truth anyway. Max helped me. My mom helped me. Dr. Martinez helped me, and now I can talk again." She paused, gathering her courage. "If you're scared and you can't talk, you can find another way to tell people what's wrong. There's always another way, and people will listen if you keep trying." The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Lisa's arm came around her daughter, and Max, positioned at Sarah's side, let out a small, almost celebratory bark. 2 years after the trial, Sarah was thriving. She was excelling academically, had a close group of friends, and had become something of a minor celebrity in Portland's domestic violence advocacy circles. She was invited to speak at schools and community centers about her experience, always with Max by her side. But what Sarah understood, in a way that only someone who had lived it could understand, was that her speaking out wasn't about being brave or special. It was about the simple, fundamental act of refusing to let trauma have the final word. Judge Harrison continued his work advocating for systemic change. He consulted with courts in other states about how to better serve traumatized witnesses. He mentored younger judges on the importance of flexibility and creativity in pursuing justice. And whenever he saw Sarah in the community, at a grocery store, a public event, a community center, he would make a point of stopping to speak with her. He would acknowledge the change she had catalyzed, the ripples that had spread from her courtroom testimony across an entire state's judicial system. "Thank you," he would say to her simply, "for showing us a better way." Sarah, now growing into her own agency and voice, would smile and stroke Max's ears. "I just told the truth," she would respond. "Max just helped me do it." What neither of them said aloud, but both understood deeply, was that sometimes telling the truth requires finding a language beyond words. Sometimes courage looks like a 7-year-old girl and a golden retriever in a courtroom, speaking to each other in a language born from trauma but expressing something infinitely more powerful than pain. The unstoppable human need for justice, for voice, for someone to listen and believe. That need, Sarah had discovered, cannot be silenced, not by violence, not by fear, not by any force on earth. It will find a way to speak, even if it must borrow the voice of a dog, and in doing so, it transforms not just individual lives but entire systems. That was Sarah's legacy. That was the gift her trauma had paradoxically given to the world. And the courtroom had never been the same since.